Good evening. I know. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are presenting a session on honest conversations about racism 2.0. We are speaking about the Catholic Church. Marge Trinkle, Sarah Luterot, and myself, Natasha Bias, will be the presenters during the session. You did receive prep material or pre-session materials that encompassed a timeline that had a wealth of information, video on Black Faith Matters, as well as Sister Thea Bowman's full conversation that she had with the United States bishops. And so hopefully you all had the opportunity to view all of that material prior to signing on today. Next slide, please. So honest conversations about racism 2.0. So following our Lenten program that some of you joined us in, Honest Conversations About Race 2.0 seeks to continue to open our hearts and minds to people of all races as we work individually and as a community to end the evil of racism while we engage parishioners of St. John's and other brothers and sisters in Christ in a journey of learning and action. Next slide, please. If you can go back to the previous slide, please, thank you. So for this evening, as I indicated, we are going to have a discussion about the Catholic Church. And the goal of this evening's session is to review the history of the exploitation and discrimination against Africans and African Americans by the Catholic Church in the United States of America, from enslavement to Jim Crow and up to the present day. We will also consider and discuss how the Catholic Church and our faith families have called out the sin and the steps that have been taken to make amends.
So we're going to now go to our opening prayer. This was a prayer that was developed by Dr. Martin Luther King and is very appropriate for us this evening. If you're going to pray with us, please mute yourselves. When our eyes do not see the gravity of racial justice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes, O Lord. When out of fear we are frozen into inaction, give us a spirit of bravery, O Lord. When we try our best, but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility, O Lord. When the chaos of this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity, O Lord. When it becomes easier to point fingers outwards, help us to examine our own hearts, O Lord. God of truth, in your wisdom enlighten us. God of hope, in your kindness heal us. Creator of all people, in your generosity guide us. Amen. And that was by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We did have an agreement last time of how we were going to conduct these sessions. Just wanted to review them with you. That we agreed to stay open, that we would consider that everyone's experiences are important and unique and that we can learn from them. That everyone would be encouraged to be fully present and share with each other. That we would respect confidentiality. After our time together, you may want to share some ideas or questions, but not people's names. That way everyone will feel comfortable in sharing. Listen fully. Focus on group members when they're speaking. So if you're a person who likes to play with the computer or look at your phone, we ask you to really treat this as a conversation and fully focus with the people that are here. Extend grace to one another as we're all carrying burdens, some that you brought with you today, and some people will have difficulty with these topics, that they will be painful for them, or there may be things that bring back memories that are hard to share. So please extend that grace. Be visible if you can so that people can see you, and then embrace one another's company and perspectives. And if you feel you can't agree with these perspectives, with these things, then this conversation may not be the conversation for you. So we'd ask you to look at the website, and we would respectfully ask you to access the information there, but to right now leave, because we will be using that agreement in our discussions today. So looking at the session agenda, it's like other sessions. There'll be a contents portion where we ask you to stay muted and save your questions for the breakout sessions. Jot down notes about anything you might find striking that you can actually discuss during the breakout sessions. We'll have breakout sessions that'll be facilitator led, and it'll be structured around discussion questions. There may be questions that you'll have that we won't have time to discuss, or might be really hard to discuss in that format. And there will be a parking lot. The facilitators will take those questions and then send things out later. We will do a taking action. We won't really have time to do a group sharing this time, but you will be able to share in the chat. And everything in this presentation, except for the breakout sessions and group sharing, will be recorded and made available on St. John's website, along with the slides. So we're going to go right into the content and look at the early history. And a lot of people do not realize that African Americans have actually been a part of the Catholic experience from way back at the beginning of our country. And back in 1565, they helped to establish the oldest town in the United States, which was St. Augustine, Florida. Then in 1693, Spain freed slaves in Florida who converted to Catholicism, which again added many additional Black Catholics. In the early 1700s, Jesuits in Maryland inherited and used slave labor to work lands received from Lord Baltimore, and you can see his picture there on the right. And then by 1781, 1/5 of the Catholics in Maryland were Black. So next slide, please. From the 1700s to the Civil War, the bishops, seminaries, religious orders, and monasteries all owned enslaved people. Some of them were important and well-known bishops like John Carroll in Maryland, who owned many, many slaves. But there were others, the Bishop of Louisiana, Bishop of Kentucky, the Bishop of Alabama, all owned slaves. The seminaries of the Vincentians in the Missouri and the Sulpicians in Maryland and Kentucky owned slaves and were served by enslaved people. The Carmelite sisters in Maryland, the Ursulines in Louisiana, the Dominican sisters, the Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of Loretta, all owned and enslaved people. And in many of the resources that we looked at, there was a quote that really stood out. It could be said that in the period before the Civil War, the Catholic Church in the South was built and maintained by the labor of Black Catholic slaves. Back in 1837, if you remember, the Jesuits did have enslaved people, and at that time they began in 1837 began having some financial difficulties in being able to finance Georgetown University. And the way that they decided to handle that was to sell almost 300 enslaved people to slave brokers in the South. And this was a bit of a scandal, a big scandal at the time, because they had promised that they would not sell any of these slaves to non-Catholic owners, and they would not break up families of enslaved people. And they did both things. And people who were Catholics were unable to practice their Catholic faith when they were sold to non-Catholic families in many instances, and families were broken and scattered to different places. In 1839, Pope Gregory XVI wrote a letter condemning the slave trade as inhuman, but one of the bishops from South Carolina defended the American domestic slave trade. He said that that was not the same and it didn't apply. The Vatican didn't agree, but his views were spread throughout the United States. And as a matter of fact, even some people said, well, slavery was a good thing because it allowed for more people to be converted, which was sort of a very non-gospel way of thinking about things. In 1829 and 1842, 2 orders of Black nuns were established to minister to Black Catholics because Black women were not permitted to join white orders. And later, white women were not able to join those Black orders because of the segregation laws. And the order that in 1829 was the Oblate order, and in 1842 was the Sisters of the Holy Family. And some of this history is not well known, so we're going to see just a very short part of a clip where they're talking about it.
You have Patrick Healy, who was a Jesuit and became the president of Georgetown University. Next, you have James Augustine Healy, who was ordained as the first Black bishop in 1875. And then up top, you have Father Alexander Sherwood Healy. He went by Sherwood. He served as a theologian at the First Vatican Council. And Mr. Healy immigrated from Ireland and moved to Georgia. He had about 1,500 acres of land, and he owned enslaved people. There was a woman who was half African, half white, who was a slave that he developed a relationship with, and that was the Healy's mother. They had about 8 children. And as you can see with their complexion, they're very fair skinned. It was told that Sherwood, one could notice Sherwood's mixed race, during certain seasons. But Patrick and James and the others were very clear in self-identifying as white. And interestingly, they had to self-identify as white, one, because otherwise they were considered slaves. In Georgia, they were enslaved. They were born of an enslaved person, and regardless of who their father was, they were considered slaves. And their dad wanted to move them out of Georgia, and he moved them up north. And so that's why how they were educated at Holy Cross. When Father Patrick Healy became the president of Georgetown, he went out to seek money from various organizations and people, and doing so, representing himself as a white priest. And interestingly, the church knew of their heritage, but supported the recognition. They supported and also recognized them as being white. Next slide, please. So in 1886, Venerable Augustus Tolton was the first US Catholic ordained priest who identified as African American, although he was ordained in Rome. There was no American seminary that would accept him, so he studied at the Urban College in Rome, where he was ordained. Of course, he ran into a lot of hostility from neighboring priests in his first parish of Quincy, Illinois. He moved to Chicago. We had organized the first Black parish in that city. And to the day of his death, he always remembered how unwelcomed he felt and the experiences he had to go through in being a Black priest, an African-American priest. Next slide, please. In December 1891, Father Charles Randolph Uncles was the first African-American man ordained into the priesthood here in the United States. Father Uncles was from Baltimore, and he was ordained here. He actually, 2 weeks after being ordained, he had led, actually a couple of weeks after being ordained, he had an early Christmas Mass, and the Afro-American newspaper here in Baltimore said that there were so many people out there waiting to get into this early morning mass, and the vibrant celebration was a sight to be seen. He also co-founded the Society of the St. Josephs of the Sacred Heart, which is also known as the Josephites, as we know. And it was formed to minister to the African-American community because he felt that African-American Catholics and the African-American community were not being served. Next slide, please. So between 1891 and 1910, there were 5 Black priests who were ordained. In the 1900, white orders of sisters had explicit formal policies against admitting Black women. Between 1910 and 1930, there were 3 African-American priests ordained, and the apostolic delegation files revealed that the Roman Curia were not impressed by the efforts made on behalf of Black Catholics by the bishops in the United States. In 1920, the first seminary for Black priests was opened in Greenville, Mississippi, and it was founded by the SVD fathers. They're French, not American, because the US bishops preferred for foreign priests to minister to African-American Catholics. Next slide, please. So during the 1919 race riots.
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
Okay, I was muted, sorry. So now we're into the 1920s, 1940s, which is really the Jim Crow era. And lynching, of course, going on, 1919, race riots and lynching in the US. Despite requests from Rome, as in the earlier slide, the bishops in the US resisted addressing the topic at their annual meeting. However, we're starting to see organization of Black Catholics themselves, and the newly formed Committee for the Advancement of Colored Catholics was publicly urging the bishops to denounce discrimination. But we see considerable resistance from the US bishops to do that for many years. In the 1930s, just as an example, the Catholic hierarchy segregated all the African Americans in Harlem in St. Mark's Parish, which was founded in 1907, and again served by foreign priests, by Irish priests. There was a Black priest, Father Lucas, who has written about that time, and he recalled one zealous priest standing on the church steps of another church with a bullwhip to discourage any Blacks from attending services. And Father Lucas reflects, he was himself a Black priest, this wasn't the bad, bad South. This was the good, good North. And this was going on. Throughout the 1940s, many Catholic parishes still required Black members to sit in the back pews. And I think some of our own parishioners may have experienced that as children or have heard of it from their parents. And they were the last to receive Eucharist. We have in the next video clip a very nice testimony from an elderly African-American parishioner at St. Bernardine's.
Been here for 54 years. When I was 8 and first came here, it was of Caucasian persuasion. We were one of the first African-American families to come here. We were asked to sit in the back pews because there were so many of us. I have 8 sisters and brothers, so it was 10 of us. My father did not set well with my father. So every Sunday he would bring us to the front of the church, and the way he explained that to the children was that it made us closer to Jesus, and that's what we needed, to be closer to Jesus. I have watched the church change from that church that made me feel I should sit in the back of the church at 8 to the point I am now at 62, where I feel extremely comfortable sitting in the front of the church because that makes me very close to Jesus.
So now we see in the late 50s, the bishops are starting to speak up. And in 1958, for the first time, they denounced racial prejudice as immoral. Also, in the late 1960s, we see increasing organization amongst Black Catholics, and they're not so happy about what's going on. The first Black Clergy Caucus declared the Catholic Church in the United States, it's primarily a white racist institution, and it's addressed itself primarily to white society and is definitely part of that society. So when I read those types of words, I'm so amazed that the Black Catholics hung in to this church, which had treated them so badly. Also about 1968, you get the formation of the National Black Sisters Conference, the National Black Catholic Seminarians Association, and the National Convention of Black Lay Catholics, all of whom are going to speak up on their own behalf. So the bishops are starting to move, and in that same year, they acknowledged the problem in a statement called the National Catholic Crisis, where they recognized the fact that racist attitudes exist not only in the hearts of men, but in the fabric of their institutions. It is evident we did not do enough. We have much left to do. Well, they continue to speak good words, but it's a long time before really something happens. So I think the next slide will take us into, okay, I think this is yours, Natasha.
Yeah. So as Sarah has indicated, there's a lot of there's some literature and lip service that is being paid by the American Catholic bishops regarding racism. And so in 1979, in a pastoral letter that's titled "Brothers and Sisters to Us," the American bishops identified racism as a sin. And there was a survey of 10 years that the Bishops' Committee on Black Catholics concluded there had been a pathetic, anemic response from the archdiocese and dioceses around the country. So again, although we do have these statements being made, the question is, are actions following and consistent with those statements? In 1989, and this was about within a month of Sister Thea Bowman's death, she had suffered from cancer. She had addressed the United States Catholic bishops about what it meant, what it means to be Black and Catholic. And this is a portion of her address.
What does it mean to be Black and Catholics? Catholic, it means that I come to my church fully functioning. That doesn't frighten you, does it? I come to my church fully functioning. I bring myself, my Black self, all that I am, all that I have, all that I hope to become. I bring my whole history, my traditions, my experience, my culture, my African-American song and dance and gesture and movement and teaching and preaching and healing and responsibility as gift to the church. I bring a spirituality that our Black American bishops told us. They just told us what everybody who knew. That spirituality is contemplative and biblical and holistic, bringing to religion a totality of minds and imagination, of memory, of feeling and passion and emotion and intensity. A faith that is embodied, incarnate praise, a spirituality that knows how to find joy even in the time of sorrow.
And as Sister Thea Bowman, shared, bringing, her whole self to church. There is another clip that we'd like to share with you from St. Bernardine's.
In the 1960s in our country, we went through very turbulent times. I came here as pastor in 1975 and began to try to develop a style of worship that included an enculturation of African American Catholic spirituality and a style of being church that involved active community presence.
Hallelujah! Hi! I know that there's a dance in this place somewhere. There's a dance! Hallelujah! This is the way we do it in the Baptist church.
We wanted to tap into the rich resources of African American Christianity. Gospel music, of course, is a key to that. It was very strange to the Catholic Church. I think we were probably the third or fourth gospel choir in Baltimore, in the Catholic.
So there are various orders of nuns and priests, including the Jesuits at Georgetown University, who began, and this is 2000 to present, who began to admit their culpability for owning enslaved people and study ways to make amends. So as Marge had mentioned about it actually was 272 women, men, and children who were enslaved, who were sold to slave owners in Louisiana by the Jesuits to support Georgetown financially as it was going, since it had a lot of debt. The university had decided in 2015 that those descendants or descendants from those people would, if they were to apply to Georgetown, that their application would be viewed as though they were family members of faculty administration. And so that's one way in which they see in making amends. Of course, I don't know, I guess we could discuss whether that's far enough during discussion, but that is one way that the university is trying to make amends and recognizing their culpability. But there, that's progress, but it's slow. In 2004, there was a study by Catholic bishops that found that 64% of Catholics reported that they had not heard a single sermon on racism or racial justice over the entire 3-year cycle of the lectionary. So the question is, we have these pronouncements made over and over again, but inside, when we're worshiping together, are we having a conversation? In 2018, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts. Some welcomed the pastoral letter as an encouraging step, and others felt that it was just too little, too late. Next slide. Sarah.
So now we have 2000, this is an interview. Father Brian Massingale is a Jesuit professor at Fordham University, and he is very outspoken on the issue of how the church has treated Black Catholics. So following on from what we were just saying about the bishops talking out, but maybe not doing everything that should be done, Father Massingale was interviewed after the George Floyd massacre by America Magazine, and we just got a clip from this interview in which he reflects on the bishop's statements, and in particular on the that particular pastoral letter that Natasha referred to. So we go to the video clip now, please.
As we know, in 2018, the bishops passed a pastoral letter on the sin of racism, Open Wide Our Hearts. And I thought the statement was inadequate then. And I think the statement is so inadequate that it's completely irrelevant to what is going on now. And someone asked me the other day, well, what's the greatest weakness of the church's engagement with racism? And I say that the greatest weakness of the church's engagement with the sin of racism is that it frames its statements and its action in ways that are calculated not to disturb white people. In other words, the comfort of white Catholics outweighs the terror that people of color have to live with because of the racism of this country. And I say that not in terms of I want to tear the church down. I've been a priest for over 37 years. I've given my life to this institution. But I have to be honest and say that the Catholic Church has prioritized the comfort of whites over a commitment to justice. And we don't see this in other areas. We're more than willing to make people uncomfortable when it comes to our advocacy for life. And we're more than willing to make people uncomfortable when it comes to our advocacy on issues of sexual morality, and especially in LGBTQ issues. We have no problem making people uncomfortable there. But when it comes to issues of race, that's when we see this pullback and this kind of this overly cautious approach that refuses to state the blunt truth. Let me give us an example of that. In the 2018 letter, when they talk about police violence, they say something like, we have to admit that there are times when people of color find their interactions with the police marked by fear. In the very next sentence, though, we condemn rhetoric that's directed against the police. It's the only place in the document that the word condemn appears is in defense of police, and there's nowhere a critique of the fundamental culture of policing that leads to the kind of tragedies that we've been seeing over and over and over again.
So next slide, please. So I'd like you to really try and hold some of those words close, because we will come back to reflect on them during the breakout session. But I want to move on now to what actually demonstrates that this message that the bishops have been trying to put out is really not strong enough and is not penetrating the Catholic community. And this is based on a study carried out by the Public Religion Research Institute in 2018. And they asked the question, what percentage, the answer is, what percentage agree that either Confederate flags or Confederate monuments are more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism? Now, we may think that that's a very evangelical position, and okay, evangelicals think that way. But just look at the numbers. The top line, the top two bars, one for the monuments, one for the flags, reflects the white evangelical Protestant response. Yes, they pretty much agree. It's a symbol of Southern pride. Then you go to mainline Protestants, just a little bit less, particularly when it comes to the flags. But look at where Catholics are, not so very different. And then you look at the white religiously unaffiliated, noticeably different. And as you would expect, Black Protestants have a very different view of the matter. So these attitudes are very entrenched in the Catholic community, and they haven't been dislodged by whatever the pronouncements the bishops are making. This is just one example of many that come out of this study. And one of the statements that made by the author of this study in a very wonderful book, White Too Long, generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that will make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. Now, who agrees with that? 67% of white evangelical Protestants, 62% of white mainline Protestants, 57% of Catholics agree that generations of slavery have made it difficult. So 43% don't agree that it's difficult. In other words, there's very little empathy for the situation that black people have faced in this country. So that's just an example, and a lot more to be found in the book, which I think will be referenced it's referenced in the handout that you got with all the timeline, of which we've just taken a small extract for this session. So next slide, please. So finally, we're coming to recent events. We know our own Archbishop published the journal Journey to Racial Justice, where he acknowledged the Church's role in slavery and ongoing manifestations of racism, and included concrete steps to be taken by the Archdiocese. I can't see everybody, but it would be interesting to have a show of hands. How many people have read that? How many people are aware of the document, and how many people have read it? I don't going to embarrass everybody, and I couldn't see you even if I wanted to. But it's on the Archdiocesan website. When we were running the program, Honest Conversations About Racism in Lent, we wanted copies, we couldn't get any to distribute. In 2020, the Baltimore Archdiocese set up a racism working group, and they've been trying to get organized. We know it's taking them a good bit of time to get organized. We know of a parish that has been really trying to get help and has not been able to get help. So we know there's a new director appointed. Hopefully things will start to move soon. So they're trying, but it's taking a long time. Of course, we also know and can celebrate the fact that Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington was the first African-American cardinal appointed in 2020. Some numbers that we found on the US Conference of Catholic Bishops website. As of 2020, African-Americans represented roughly 3 million or 4% of US Catholics, only about 1% of US priests, and 7 active bishops with 1 archbishop represents about 3% of bishops. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Next slide, please.
This is actually just a look at some of the things that have happened at St. John's. Around the year 2000, the Diversity Committee was formed to promote diversity in church ministries so that the ministries would actually look like the diversity that's in our parish, which has been a diverse parish right from the beginning, and to celebrate our different cultures. You may remember back around that time that there were a number of masses that celebrated and had different cultural slants to them, and had celebrations afterwards where people wore dress that was specific to their culture and different foods and things. In 2012, Father Ferdinand became our first Black pastor, and we were lucky enough to have him for 10 more years. In 2020, during the time of George Floyd, we had signage that indicated the parish's support for working to end racism, and we're hearing homilies about racism. From 2020 to the present, our parish has worked with our sister parish to supply materials and prayers for Black Catholic History Month, which occurs in November, which is why we're holding this session in November. In 2020, the Racial Justice Committee was formed, and also started a book study and conversation group about some of the issues of racism in our area and also the church at large. In 2021, our parish was part of a grant to hold listening sessions that were focused on learning the barriers that communities of color face accessing serious illness and end-of-life services. In 2022, during Lent, Honest Conversations of Racism, that was sponsored by the Racial Justice Committee, engaged 120 parishioners. And then in June of 2022, the Diversity Committee sponsored a talk by Sharita Thomas, who was the diocesan interim director of the Office of Black Catholic Ministries at that particular point in time. Also in 2022, the parish participated in a campaign to highlight and advocate the 6 African Americans who are awaiting canonization, which would be a wonderful thing to see happen. One of them is Mother Mary Lang. Another one is Servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman. Then in the fall of 2022, we began these conversations to look more deeply in different aspects of racism. So that's a quick summary of some of the things that have happened with Black Catholics in the Catholic Church. We're now, could you go to the next slide, please, Julie? We're now going to go into discussion and breakout sessions. So each person has been pre-assigned to a breakout group with the facilitator by Scott. you'll be invited to join a group, and you'll have about 30 to 40 minutes to discuss some questions in your small group. Yeah, it's about 7:45. So when you get an invitation to join a group, please say yes. Yes, you want to join, and then you'll be switched to a group.
Okay, well, I'm just going to read briefly from the slide, and then I'd like to go just to see everybody. We had a few ideas for what do we do with this information, but we'd also like to gather ideas from the participants. So while I'm just reading out these couple of ideas about something you can do to try and absorb and understand and work this through and maybe take action, be thinking, what do you think as yourself or for our parish? Because at the conclusion of this series, we're going to be wanting to do something with all the information we've shared. So one thing is maybe go to attended church where the major culture is different from your own. Go to Mass at St. Bernardine's, and how does this expression of faith add a new dimension to your own? What do you learn from it? The church has made many statements over the years. The statements are good. They may not go far enough. They weren't acted on much of the time. But what resonates with you as you read them? How do you want to react? What do you think they should say different? Those are two possibilities. ... What else do we want to share that we can do? And we're only going to be able to take time to take from a few people. But if you could raise your hand in a fairly visible way so I don't miss you, or if somebody sees somebody raising their hand, they could point it out. So what can we do individually as a parish? I'm not interested in what the church should do out there, because I want to bring it into our own life and into our own what is within ours to control, what is ours to do.
Thank you.
Okay, Natasha, over to you.
Thank you. And so Marge is going to lead us in our prayer. Before we have our closing prayer, I wanted to mention that I don't know if you all noticed in the chat that there were, and I guess I don't want to assume that it was Dana, I didn't see who was contributing, but that there were people who shared their life experiences, some who we know, some who we don't know, and especially the clip from St. Bernardine's. And I believe, if I read quickly, that that woman who shared and testified and regarding her experience is no longer with us. And so if we can, with this prayer and then with our heart, send prayers of gratitude to her spirit, because without people speaking out and sharing their own experiences, we don't become wise. So I just want us to remember that these experiences have affected people's lives. So Marge, if you would please.
Okay. Do our closing prayer. And Lord, we just thank you for bringing us together and for all those who had the courage to speak and to really share from the depths of their heart. And if you could pray this with me, if you could mute yourself so we don't have echoes. But, oh Lord our God, in your mercy and kindness, no thought of ours is left unnoticed, no desire or concern ignored. You have proven that blessings abound when we fall on our knees in prayer, and so we turn to you in our hour of need. Surrounded by violence and cries for justice, we hear your voice telling us what is required, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk humbly with your God. Fill us with your mercy so that we in turn may be merciful to others. Strip away pride, suspicion, and racism so that we may seek peace and justice in our communities. Strengthen our hearts so they beat only to the rhythm of your holy will. Flood our path with your light as we walk humbly toward a future filled with encounter and unity. Be with us, O Lord, in our efforts, for only by the prompting of your grace can we progress toward virtue. We ask this through Jesus Christ, our Lord, and all God's people say, Amen. That's from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Julie, our last slide, please. Thank you. So thank you again for spending these 90 minutes with us, with each other, in learning and listening and contributing. This is only the second session. We have 4 going in the future. The next is going to be on January the 11th. We're going to, and again, January the 11th, we had earlier materials that indicated January the 4th, but with the holiday season, we thought January 11th would probably fit into people's schedules. So we're going to be dealing with and discussing economic development. February 1st is education. The 12th of April is healthcare. And then the 3rd of May is the criminal justice system. And again, we want to provide a historical context because we know that not everyone knows the history, and with recognizing and learning about the history, we might be able to see things and have a different lens on what's going on at the present. Also, there is a survey that is in the chat, and we will also be sending out a survey. So please, if you can open up the survey in the chat now while everything is fresh, you can complete it. If not, please save it so that you do complete the survey, because we really are interested in knowing, and Julie, if we can stop sharing. We're really interested in knowing how these sessions are landing with you, because as I said, this is the second and we have 4, and we can improve as we want to improve as we continue on. And on behalf of St. John's Racial Justice Committee, I'd like to thank you all again. Marge and Sarah done a tremendous job in gathering all of this material. It has been an honor and a pleasure working with them. The other committee members stepped up. Julie, thank you for your assistance. Scott, thank you from Parish for being here and helping us throughout as well. And again, thank you all, because we can only do this as a community, and we can act as individuals and as a community. So you all have a great evening, and hopefully we'll see you in January. You will have to register again. So right after every session, you have to register. And please, if there's someone that wasn't here, encourage them to join in. You can always, send a message to either myself or Sarah, indicating that someone wishes to join the conversation, or to Scott, and we make sure that they'll have the information. So thank you again, and have a very good night.